The Earthen Goblet by Harindranath Chattopadhyay. O silent goblet, red from head to heel, how did you feel when you were being twirled upon the potter's wheel before the potter gave you to the world? I felt a conscious impulse in my clay to break away from the great potter's hand that burned so warm. I felt vast feeling of sorrow to be cast into my present form. Before that fatal hour that saw me captive on the potter's wheel and cast into this crimson goblet sleep, I used to feel the fragrant friendship of a little flower whose root was in my bosom very deep. The potter has drawn out the living breath of me and given me a form which is the death of me. My past unshapely natural state was best, with just one flower flaming through my breast. Harindranath Chattopadhyay was an Indian poet, writer, actor and politician. He was born in 1898 in Hyderabad, India, to a Bengali family. He received his education at St. Xavier's College in Mumbai and later studied law at the University of London. However, he was more interested in the arts, particularly poetry and drama. In 1923, he returned to India and became involved in the Indian independence movement. He was a member of the Indian National Congress and also worked as a journalist for several newspapers. Chattopadhyay is known for his poetry, which reflects a blend of Indian and Western influences. He wrote both in English and Bengali and is considered one of the pioneers of modern Indian English poetry. Later in life, Chattopadhyay was involved in politics and served as a member of the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of the Indian Parliament, from 1970 to 1976. He passed away in 1990 at the age of 91. He is remembered as a multifaceted personality who made significant contributions to Indian literature, cinema, and politics. These are some of his widely read English poems. Chattopadhyay's poetry reflects a variety of themes. Indian nationalism is one of his themes. He was deeply committed to the Indian independence movement, and his poetry often reflects this theme. His poetry celebrates India's rich cultural heritage and highlights the struggle for freedom from British colonial rule. He was also committed to social justice, and his poetry often critiques social inequality and injustice. He was a champion of the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized, and his poetry frequently highlights their struggles and challenges. Chattopadhyay's poetry often celebrates the beauty and power of nature. He frequently uses imagery drawn from the natural world to convey his ideas and emotions. His poetry also explores the complexities of human relationships, including love, relationship, friendship, and family ties. His poetry often expresses the joys and pains of love and the challenges of maintaining relationships over time. His poetry also explores spiritual themes, including the nature of the self, the relationship between the individual and the divine, and the quest for enlightenment. His poetry frequently draws on Indian philosophical and religious traditions to explore these themes. The Earthen Goblet by Harindranath Chattopadhyay. O silent goblet, from head to heel, how did you feel when you were being twirled upon the potter's wheel before the potter gave you to the world? I felt a conscious impulse in my clay to break away from the great potter's hand that burned so warm. I felt vast feeling of sorrow to be cast into my present form. Before that fatal hour that saw me captive on the potter's wheel and cast into this crimson goblet sleep, I used to feel the fragrant friendship of a little flower whose root was in my bosom very deep. The potter has drawn out the living breath of me and given me a form which is the death of me. My past unshapely natural state was best, with just one flower flaming through my breast. Let's try to understand the first stanza of the poem. Now, this whole poem is written as a dialogue between the poet and the goblet. So here the goblet is personified. The very first line of the poem is an apostrophe where the writer addresses the goblet, "O silent goblet, red from head to heel." Then the poet asks how the goblet fell when it was being made on the potter's wheel. This is a poetic way of asking about the goblet's experience of being created, and it suggests that the goblet has a sense of consciousness or self-awareness. In the first line, the writer has used this adjective silent to modify the goblet, silent goblet. Here, the silent can be interpreted as the goblet's way of showing resistance and defiance and even rebellion. It also suggests that he is unhappy about his current situation. The third line, "when you were being twirled," creates a sense of motion or action. In the fourth line, the potter can be taken as a metaphor for a creator or a high power. The potter's wheel can be taken as a symbol of creation and transformation. I hope you all have seen a potter's wheel. Now, potter's wheel is a tool used by potters to shape and mold clay into pottery. The use of the potter's wheel also suggests that the goblet was created with intention and care, and that it has a greater purpose beyond just being a simple drinking vessel. In the second stanza, the silent goblet breaks its silence and opens up to the question posed by the poet. I felt a conscious impulse in my clay. Here, conscious impulse means a strong feeling or urge that arises from a person's conscious mind or awareness, rather than from an unconscious or automatic response. Here, the goblet is aware of its own existence and has a sense of self. The goblet is not merely a passive object being shaped by the potter's hand, but it has a conscious desire to break away and assert its own independence. In the third line, great potter's hand refers to the external forces that shape and mold the earthen goblet. The potter's hand represents the creative power that gives shape to the raw material of clay and transforms it into something beautiful and functional. In a broader sense, the great potter's hand can also be seen as a metaphor for the forces of nature or the divine power that shapes the universe and everything in it. In the last three lines of the second stanza, the earthen goblet expresses its unhappiness at being cast into its present form by the potter. I felt vast feeling of sorrow to be cast into my present form. Here, the use of the word vast suggests that the goblet's sorrow is deep and intense. The goblet is unhappy with its current state of being, which is determined by external forces beyond its control. This can be seen as a metaphor for the human experience of feeling limited by our circumstances and the forces that shape our lives. In the third stanza, the earthen goblet describes its life before it was molded into its current form by the potter. The goblet remembers a time when it felt the fragrant friendship of a little flower whose roots were buried deep within it. In the first line, that fatal hour suggests that the goblet's transformation on the potter's wheel was a turning point that changed its life forever, and it can never return to its former state. The second line, that saw me captive on the potter's wheel, suggests that the goblet was held prisoner by the potter's hands. It was unable to resist the transformation taking place. It also implies a sense of powerlessness and vulnerability on the part of the goblet, which was being shaped and molded according to the potter's will. In the third line, and cast into this crimson goblet sleeve, refers to the final form that the goblet took after it was shaped and fired in the kiln. The phrase goblet sleeve may be interpreted as a metaphor for the goblet's dormant state before it was put to use. The word sleeve suggests a state of inactivity, and it also implies that the goblet was not fully alive or conscious in its current form. The imagery of the little flower in the last three lines suggests a sense of connection and intimacy between the two. The goblet and the flower are intertwined, and their fates are linked in some way. The goblet also describes the flower as fragrant, which suggests that it brought a sense of beauty and joy to the goblet's life. Overall, this stanza emphasizes the goblet's longing for a deeper connection with the natural world and a sense of wholeness and harmony which it has lost as a result of its transformation into an object of human use and consumption. In the fourth stanza, the line, "The potter has drawn out the living breath of me," suggests that the potter has given the goblet a new form. But at the same time, this new form is a kind of death for the goblet. This is because the goblet has lost its natural shape and state. It has been transformed into an object of human use and consumption. Then in the second line, the phrase, "a form which is the death of me," conveys a sense of loss, disconnection, and perhaps even a sense of tragedy. The third line, "my past unshapely natural state was best," highlights the goblet's longing for its previous state of existence, which was unformed and unshaped, but also natural. The line suggests that the goblet's original state, before it was transformed by the potter, was its true and best self. The final line, "with just one flower flaming through my breast," refers to the single flower that used to grow within the goblet when it was in its natural state. This flower symbolizes the goblet's connection to the natural world and its sense of beauty, simplicity, and even purity. The use of the word flaming also suggests The intensity and brightness of the flower's presence within the goblet, and the contrast between this natural beauty and the artificial form that the goblet now possesses. What are the themes discussed in the poem The Earthen Goblet by Harindranath Chattopadhyay? This poem can be of a person from a rural village who has experienced the pains of the modern world. The poem uses the metaphor of a goblet created on a potter's wheel to explore the speaker's feelings of being molded and shaped by outside forces, and the loss of his previous identity and connection to nature. The idea of feeling a vast feeling of sorrow at being cast into present form suggests a sense of alienation or displacement, which could certainly be a common experience for people who have had to leave rural areas and adapt to life in urban or modernized settings. The reference to a fragrant friendship of a little flower that was once buried in the speaker's bosom also highlights the loss of connection to nature that can come with modernization and urbanization. Overall, the poem could be read as a commentary on the experience of losing one's sense of self and connection to nature in the face of modernization and the pain that can come with that process. It is possible to interpret this poem as a criticism against people who use natural things for their own advantage. The imagery of the goblet being created on a potter's wheel suggests a process of shaping and molding that is imposed upon the natural clay, and the speaker's feelings of being trapped and confined within his new form could be seen as a metaphor for the way in which natural resources are often exploited and transformed for human use. It is also possible to interpret this poem as a criticism against the education system and its attempts to shape students into rigid role models. The imagery of the goblet being created on a potter's wheel suggests a process of molding and shaping that is imposed upon the natural clay. And the goblet's feelings of being trapped and confined within his new form could be seen as a metaphor for the way in which the education system often tries to mold students into a predetermined shape or form. The speaker's desire to break away from the potter's hand and to resist being molded into a particular form could be interpreted as a critique of the way in which education can sometimes stifle creativity and individuality, forcing students to conform to certain standards and expectations. The line, "The potter has drawn out the living breath of me and given me a form which is death of me," could also be read as a critique of the way in which education can sometimes drain the life and vitality out of students, reducing them to mere shells of their former selves. This poem can also be interpreted as a celebration of art and creativity. The imagery of the goblet being created on a potter's wheel celebrates the process of artistic creation, and the speaker's description of the clay feeling a conscious impulse to break away from the potter's hand suggests the power and vitality of artistic inspiration. What are the techniques employed by the writer in this poem, The Earthen Goblet? Imagery is one of the powerful techniques used by the writer. The poem uses vivid imagery to describe the process of creating a goblet on a potter's wheel, as well as the speaker's feelings of being trapped and confined within his new form. The imagery of the clay being molded and shaped, and the goblet's description of feeling a vast feeling of sorrow to be cast into my present form helps to create a vivid picture in the reader's mind of the process of artistic creation. The poem personifies the clay, giving it human qualities such as consciousness and a desire to break away from the potter's hand. This personification helps to convey the idea that artistic creation is a dynamic, interactive process in which the materials being used can have a will of their own. The poem uses symbolism to evoke the beauty and fragility of the natural world. The image of the flower rooted in the clay, which the speaker describes as a fragrant friendship, can be read as a symbol of the natural world and the importance of preserving its beauty and vitality. In the opening line of the poem, the writer has used an apostrophe. "O silent goblet." It's a fine example for apostrophe, as the writer has directly addressed the goblet. The use of direct speech to express goblet's feeling can be taken as a technique used in the poem. By giving the goblet a voice and allowing it to express its own feelings and experiences, the poem creates a sense of intimacy and immediacy, drawing the reader into the world of the poem. Finally, the writer has employed sound devices in this poem. What are the sound devices? Alliteration, assonance, and consonance. But unlike in my previous lessons, I haven't highlighted them in this poem. So it's up to you to find out examples for each and every sound device without the help of a teacher. So these are the techniques employed by the writer Harindranath Chattopadhyay in his poem, The Earthen Goblet. And that brings us to the end of today's session on Booktopia lessons. I hope you found it informative and educational. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you in the next lesson.